All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us to celebrate College Savings Month. My name is Tia Anderson. I am Program Services Representative for NC 529 here at College Foundation Incorporated. I'm also over NC Assist, which is an alternative loan program that we offer here at College Foundation, supporting families bridging the gap between the cost of education and financial aid. Again, I am today's presenter. I host most webinars around NC 529, so definitely look forward to seeing you all throughout the year. But again, when we mention the post-webinar survey that we send out this afternoon, definitely take some time there just to share some feedback with us as we look forward to bringing more webinar topics to you in the future. So to cover a few of today's discussion points, we'll first go over the qualified uses of the NC 529 plan. We do realize that we may have some individuals on today's call that have been a participant for some time now, or you could potentially be very new to NC 529. So we definitely want to take some time just to share again what those qualified uses are. And then we'll get into what's on the horizon as far as new expansions to the 529 plan. And then lastly, we'll cover the Dream Chaser Sweepstakes that we're hosting during the month of September. So, what is a 529 plan? Federal law allows states all across the country to develop these qualified tuition programs that support families in saving for future educational expenses. So that can be anything from college, K through 12, trade, apprenticeships, and more. And again, we'll go over what those qualified uses of the plan are, especially if you are a little newer to the conversation or maybe have not heard the conversation in some time. But here in the state of North Carolina, your earnings grow tax-free when those funds are to be used towards educational expenses. So if you are using NC 529 funds for anything that is within or with on the outside of qualified uses, that could be considered non-qualified. And we'll talk a little bit about what those things are. But as a reminder, we have covered this topic this year, so definitely revisit our past webinar that we've had about withdrawing funds and what's considered qualified versus non-qualified. However, here in North Carolina, your earnings are growing tax-free when they are used towards those educational expenses. And then if you live here in the state, you do qualify for state tax benefits. So now let's talk a little bit about how can you use those funds, right? So like I mentioned, your money is growing tax-free when those funds are to be used towards qualified educational expenses. So most commonly, families are using their NC 529 plan for college expenses. So college can include anything from tuition, room and board, books, fees, but you may be someone that's thinking, hey, if my child needs a parking pass or if my child needs a vehicle to get to and from, is that considered qualified? And unfortunately, it is not considered a qualified use. However, it's really important for you to know what's the best strategy of using your funds specifically for college. We may have individuals using their funds for K through 12 tuition. So you could be someone that has a child that is currently within a private school and there's a cost of attendance associated, right? So you could be using those funds before your child is turning 18. That doesn't apply to most or to all. However, that is a little bit of flexibility there for families. Trades, apprenticeship programs, special needs equipment. And then for some of our families that have NC 529 funds, and maybe you have excess funds, right? Maybe you've used your plan to send children, to send grandchildren. And now you're like, hey, I have this leftover funds. I don't think I'll use them in the future. What can I do with them? You may choose to use those funds towards student loan repayment. You may potentially have a beneficiary that has taken out student loans. You may have a sibling of a beneficiary that has student loans. So if that's something that applies to you, definitely be mindful of the fact that you now have that flexibility with student loan repayment. And then for some of our participants that have had a plan for at least 15 years, And again, you're still within that conversation of how can I use my funds? I've looked at all the ways of using them and I still have this excessive amount of funds. You can choose to roll those funds over into a Roth IRA for your beneficiary. So there is certain criteria that apply to that. You have to have had your plan or your account open for at least 15 years to do that. However, there's a lot of flexibility within the plan if you fall within kind of that category of wanting to figure out what's the best use if you have excessive funds. So let's talk a little bit about what's on the horizon, right? So for K through 12 tuition, as I mentioned, we do have some participants who use their funds to pay currently for private education for their child. So in the future, starting in 2026, at this current time, federal legislation has been passed with these expansions. However, we are still waiting at the state level for it to be passed. So as soon as it is passed at the state level here in North Carolina, we'll definitely keep our participants aware of those changes. So these are some things just to be mindful of starting in 2026 with this expansion. But if you are using K through 12 tuition, you may be familiar that it is up to $10,000 per beneficiary per calendar year. However, starting in 2026, that will now be increased to $20,000 per beneficiary per calendar year. So that's definitely there to support families that might have seen an increase over time with cost of education. Maybe you're paying tuition currently, and each year maybe it's going up more and more. So this is hopefully allowing that window for families to be a little bit more flexible. So now we'll get into another exciting piece that's going to expand, right? So for years, we've seen that K through 12 tuition has been that expense that's considered qualified. Starting in 2026, it'll be more than just tuition. It'll be a broader list of K through 12 expenses that you can now use NC 529 funds for. So that could be anything from curriculum to learning materials. Maybe at the start of the school year, you're buying certain learning materials for your beneficiary that's needed. You can now use NC 529 funds starting in 2026 to cover those expenses. Online educational tools or platforms. Maybe you are subscribing to a system online for your beneficiary, maybe to help with homework or to help with studying. That is now considered a qualified expense starting next year. Maybe you have a tutoring service that you're using, and maybe there's a cost associated with that. That's also another way to use funds. You may have a beneficiary that's very close to the later years of high school, and they're having that conversation about taking the ACT or taking the SAT. Those testing forms can be quite expensive, especially if you have a beneficiary that's taking it more than once, which is traditionally common. So we'll have beneficiaries that's looking to get that perfect score, maybe to meet admissions into the college that they want to pursue. However, that takes some time. Maybe they're retaking the test more than once, or maybe they're buying materials to support them with that test. Now, moving forward in 2026, you can use NC 529 funds to cover those fees as well as prep materials that's associated with both tests. And then any dual enrollment costs or special education therapies can also be used in the future. So let's talk a little bit about how adult learners can potentially now be entered into the conversation, right? We have a number of participants throughout the NC 529 plan that may be currently saving for themselves. However, starting in 2026, NC 529 funds can be used to cover expenses that include tuition, testing fees, costs for any books, equipment, or continuing education that is required to obtain or maintain a certain credential. So you may be someone that's currently within a career path where you have to potentially maintain a certain license or a certain credential every so often. And there could be a cost associated with that. So let's say you've been saving for your beneficiary for years, and you maybe have never considered yourself to potentially be a beneficiary. You could now, in the future, use yourself as a beneficiary to tackle on some of the funds or expenses associated with these types of courses. One thing to be mindful of is that if you are looking into any credential programs that may be new to you, you want to make sure that they are listed under the State Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, as well as the Federal Web Enabled Approval Management System. And that is just to make sure that when you are seeking these programs that they're actually accredited programs so that you are using your funds in a qualified way. So let's talk a little bit about what adult learners look like here in NC 529. So as you can see here, most commonly, if we have any self-participants, they're ranging between 26 to 41 years old. However, just be mindful of the fact that this could potentially be someone that has just decided to start saving for education because they find it to be important. Not necessarily that they're going to use those funds directly for themselves. They could. However, we have a lot of people who have decided just to start NC 529 plans, maybe within the future of using those funds for a child or another loved one in the future. However, this is just encouragement that if you are someone thinking about pursuing higher education for yourself as an adult, you now have that flexibility within the NC 529 plan. So we've talked pretty often about a lot of the changes that's to come, especially about what's on the horizon with these new expansions within the 529 plan. However, there are three kind of items that are not necessarily changing, so I thought it would be important still to share that there are no major updates to student loan repayment or the Roth IRA rollover. So for student loan payment, your lifetime maximum will still continue to be $10,000 per beneficiary, as well as if you choose to pay back student loans for a beneficiary sibling, the lifetime maximum will still be $10,000. The Roth IRA rollover will stay the same. That lifetime cap will continue to be $35,000. You do have an annual contribution limit. That will be $7,000. So just be mindful of those two things. They are not necessarily changing. There's no major changes to come to that in the future. However, if anything was to come about, we would definitely make sure to share that out with participants of the plan. And then lastly, our apprenticeship program will remain the same. You can utilize NC 529 funds to cover any apprenticeship expense fees such as books, fees, supplies, and equipment. So let's talk about the NC 529 to celebrate College Savings Month. Anyone who opens or contributes to an NC 529 college savings account will be entered into the Dream Chaser Sweepstakes. However, you have to register yourself. So I did include a QR code here for you. So if you want to take a second and scan that, please make sure to register before the end of the month. As a quick tip, especially on the website, you do have to read the official rules prior to registering for the sweepstakes. So if you find that you're having a hard time registering, just make sure that you're reading those official rules first, and then you may have to go to the previous page and register for the sweepstakes. However, this is a great opportunity for anyone who's new to NC 529, or maybe you contribute to an NC 529 plan. You want to make sure that you're taking advantage of this opportunity. So as a reminder, you will always have access to your account at any time through cfnc.org/NC529. You can do account maintenance. If you have any, information that needs to be updated, such as an email address, a mailing address, you want to make sure that that information is up to date. So as a reminder, please make sure to check in on your account frequently. And it's also maybe just a good rule of thumb just to see how your account is growing over time. We do realize that we have a number of participants that may contribute through payroll deduction. So with that, if you're contributing, you may make those contributions so often that you're not necessarily logging in to see, but this is just a reminder to take a glimpse back at your account, make sure things are still up to date, and if you need to make any changes, you will always have access to that, as well as access to frequently asked questions, as well as our savings calculator. If you are someone who it's, kind of considering where your savings goal should be in the future, if you have a beneficiary that is approaching their later years of high school and preparing for college, definitely take a look at our savings calculator as that could be extremely helpful of just creating those goals. And then as a reminder, we have a call center here in Raleigh, North Carolina. So they do operate Monday through Friday, specifically Monday through Thursday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then on Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. However, if you ever have any questions pertaining to your account, any changes to be made, you can do that online at cfnc.org/NC529, or you could give our call center a call. So I'll leave this slide here just for a quick second. So if you want to take a picture of that, you'll be able to do so. All right. So today's conversation was fairly short. However, we want to be able to have that time to capture any questions that you may have. I do have my email address here as well as contact information for our call center as well as our savings team. So definitely make sure if you need to reach out to us after today's call that you take a screenshot of this so that you have it. But what we'll do now is transition over to the Q&A section. So if you have any questions around today's topic or any questions that's in general about NC 529, I'll cater the next few minutes to going through those questions.